This video contains detailed descriptions of forensic investigations and graphic content related to violent crimes. Viewer discretion is advised.
In the autumn of 1987, just after Thanksgiving, an intruder broke into the Tucker residence in Arlington, Virginia. It could have been another statistic, but that night changed everything. DNA evidence and psychological profiling caught a serial killer and freed an innocent man. Discover the groundbreaking case that revolutionized police investigations.
Everything about her was very gentle. She was very soft-spoken. Just had this amazing softness about her, this human quality.
Susan Tucker, aged 44, served as a publications editor at the United States Forestry Service. During the Thanksgiving holiday, she found herself alone as her husband, Reggie, was away on a business trip to Wales.
Neither of us could put the phone down. We kept saying, "I love you." And we said this over and over again. I don't know how many times.
With no explanation, unanswered telephone calls raised concern, and neighbors observed Susan's bedroom window left wide open in the chilly November air, prompting them to alert the police. As they approached the front door, they noticed it was ajar, and inside, a woman's purse lay on the foyer floor.
I arranged calling on Monday. Couldn't get an answer, just rang.
Tucker.
I rang again. I rang again. I don't know how many times I rang.
Susan Tucker's severely decomposed body was found lying face down on the bed. It appeared she had been deceased for approximately 4 or 5 days.
Her hands were tied behind her back, her feet were tied, the head hanging over the side of the bed almost.
She had been strangled and possibly sexually assaulted.
It appeared that the killer more than likely was inside the home for quite some time. I mean, it wasn't just a very, quick in and out type of a situation. Many of the drawers had been, ransacked, had been gone through.
Upon hearing the news for the first time, Reggie Tucker was devastated.
I got bad news. And I knew it. I just knew it at that point. And I just, my whole world just fell away.
Detective Joe Horgus of the Arlington Police Homicide Unit swiftly took charge of the case. His task wouldn't be easy. For one thing, the perpetrator had taken precautions, wearing gloves and leaving behind no fingerprints. On the night of the murder, it had been raining, and he diligently cleaned the area near his point of entry.
He's smart enough to know that footprints, which is what we would have gotten from that, would maybe come back to haunt him, which kind of tells you maybe some past experience on burglaries.
The police gathered the sheets, nightgown, and the large sleeping bag covering Susan Tucker's body, aiming to identify potential blood and semen stains. They discovered hairs on the bedding near her body, in the bathroom sink, and on a washcloth found outside on the clothesline. Additionally, fragments of broken glass from the basement window were collected. All evidence was dispatched to the forensics lab for analysis. Yet, perhaps the most crucial clue lay in plain sight. The rope and knots used in Susan Tucker's strangulation. Law enforcement officers were convinced they had encountered this killer's handiwork before. 3 years earlier, a 34-year-old lawyer named Caroline Ham had suffered a similar fate in her home just 4 blocks away from Susan Tucker's residence. The killer had entered the Ham residence through a basement window and tied his victim using the same knots.
And it's not a common occurrence, not common at all, to see victims killed by using ligatures to strangle them, ropes tying up victims. It's really quite rare.
The Ham case was closed when David Vasquez confessed to her murder, resulting in a 35-year prison sentence. Could he have had an accomplice? Horgus spoke to him for several hours.
And from the way he was talking and everything and answering my questions, I didn't think he knew a damn thing about Carolyn Hamm's murder.
As Detective Horgus initiated his pursuit of Susan Tucker's killer, 100 miles away in the capital city of Richmond, police were conducting investigations into a series of murders strikingly similar.
The body of 35-year-old Debbie Davis was found inside her South Richmond apartment. She'd been raped and strangled.
In under a month, 2 young women had been sexually assaulted and strangled in their residences, just a few blocks apart.
In each case, there was a forced entry with the murderer entering by cutting the screens and entering through an open window. Each victim was strangled. Both victims were white, between the ages of 30 and 35 years.
2 weeks later, and once more he struck. This time, a 15-year-old girl was attacked and strangled in her bedroom while her family was asleep. All 3 had been bound, sexually assaulted, and strangled with rope. The knots matched those used in the Arlington cases. Detective Horgus suspected that the perpetrator of Susan Tucker's murder was the identical individual responsible for Carolyn Hamm's killing and the deaths of the 3 women in Richmond. If Horgus's assumption was accurate, a serial killer was loose on a 100-mile murderous rampage. Detective Horgus was convinced that the person responsible for the assault and death of Susan Tucker was also behind Carolyn Hamm's murder. Horgus also suspected that the same person was behind the 3 assaults and deaths in Richmond, which is about 100 miles away. However, the Richmond police weren't completely convinced.
I mean, they have 3 murders that were within a couple miles square radius, I'm guessing, or maybe even less, that, you know, and now we're trying to say that 100 miles away, we're trying to link something to theirs. It's like, yeah, get out of here. I mean, this is a local guy.
Horgus was a man, he was the perfect man for this case because he was obsessed. He knew something was wrong.
Author Paul Mones wrote the best-selling book, Stalking Justice, which delves into the cases of these 5 women and the groundbreaking investigation that followed.
Joe Horgus is motivated by the hunt. He's not a guy who's obsessed by issues of right and wrong, except for his own internal moral compass, which tells him if there's an innocent man in prison, I don't care if we got the guilty guy, we got to get the innocent man out. And he was determined to get this guy.
However, if Horgus's theory held true that all these murders were connected, he needed evidence. To obtain it, he sought assistance from the forensics lab, where scientists were examining the stains discovered on Susan Tucker's nightgown and bedding.
I found 4 semen stains, and when I analyzed the sleeping bag, I found 1 very large semen stain. I typed all of those stains.
The semen retrieved originated from an individual with type O blood and the PGM1 enzyme profile. Although this matched 13% of the population, it also corresponded to the semen found at the Carolyn Hamm murder scene. Next, they shifted their focus to the hair recovered from the Tucker crime scene.
And there are characteristics, microscopically, that can classify hair into one of 3 racial categories,
which are of European, African, or Asian ancestry. The hairs discovered at the Tucker crime scene seemed to be pubic and were not believed to be from either the victim or her husband. They were conclusively identified as being of African origin. This provided another potential connection to the Carolyn Hamm murder case. 3 years prior, around the time of Hamm's killing, a black male wearing a mask had assaulted several women in the same neighborhood. Despite efforts, the masked assailant was never caught, leading Horgus to consistently suspect that there was a connection to the Hamm murder.
Actually, the same day that Carolyn Hamm's body was found, another girl, lady, was in her house, and this black male with a mask and a knife burglarized her house, got her, and actually he did some sexual activity with her.
Both the Richmond police and later the Arlington police reached out to the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit in Quantico, Virginia. This unit has extensively interviewed numerous serial killers, to learn what similarities exist in their psychological profiles. Their insights enabled them to make several significant predictions about the killer.
We get in and look at the behavior that's left by the offender in the commission of his crime. We believe that by looking at that behavior, we can interpret the type of offender that may have committed the crime.
The fact that the strangler targeted his victims in their residences implied that he had stalked them beforehand and knew precisely when to strike. The FBI concluded that the perpetrator was between the age of 18 and 30, the quiet type, a loner, who held a menial job. He probably had a troubled relationship with his mother and began his crime spree with arson. Historically, many serial rapists and murderers begin with arson. Serial killers are usually white but could be any race. He lived or worked close to where he committed his first crimes. That's because criminals begin their crime sprees in an area where they feel most comfortable. He took sadistic pleasure in strangling his victims. He would periodically release the bindings so he could hear his victim plead for her life.
It appeared that the perpetrator had intended the victim to suffer considerably. In one case, a shoe impression was found on the victim's back.
These women were obviously first just terrified to the very bone, and then were systematically sexually assaulted, and at the end, and it's not clear whether they were dead when he did this or alive, but he also masturbated on his victims.
These semen samples would later emerge as highly significant pieces of evidence.
I can remember our prosecutor, Helen Fahey, a couple of days after the murder, asking me if this was going to be a DNA case. And I'm kind of, I don't know. I mean, we don't even know what we had got yet.
In 1987, when Susan Tucker was murdered, DNA evidence was still in its early stages. The first use of DNA evidence in a criminal case occurred just a year earlier in England, where DNA from a sample was used to convict a bakery worker for the assault and deaths of two 15-year-old girls. Horgus decided to try this new DNA testing method, dispatching the semen stains from Susan Tucker's nightgown to the Life Codes laboratory in New York. Forensic scientists were worried about possible degradation or contamination of the samples.
You basically isolate the DNA, you cut it up, you generate profiles or patterns, and you then generate these patterns on a piece of X-ray film. So it's like a picture of the DNA. And when you then compare these pictures and the components are the same in the two DNAs, that would indicate that they're from the same source.
The DNA test results could require as long as 10 weeks. Yet Detective Horgus remained without a suspect. He suspected that the person responsible for the assault and deaths of Susan Tucker and Carolyn Hamm 3 years earlier was also behind the recent masked attacks in the same area. But this individual remained at large. Horgus went to Green Valley, an Arlington locale infamous as the site of the initial attacks by the masked rapist. The FBI had briefed Horgus that perpetrators often initiate their criminal activities near their residences.
If the first rape was the first rape for this guy, then he would have lived around there, and that was very crucial to me because I didn't know that.
As he navigated through Green Valley, Horgus racked his brain, attempting to summon the names or faces of potential suspects. Young men he'd run across over the years who came from that area.
And it just so happens that Detective Horgus started to focus on this one juvenile he had dealt with or remembered him. He just couldn't place the name.
And all I could remember was Timmy. I could see his face. I remembered the approximate time period and everything that I remembered him from, but I couldn't remember his last name.
So we were running all these names through the computer, seeing when they'd been locked up and released. And suddenly he just came in and he said, Spencer, Timothy Spencer, that's the name.
And I saw where he was arrested on January the 29th, 1984, which was 4 days after Carolyn Hamm, her body was found.
Spencer's past came to light. Engaging in delinquency during his teenage years, he amassed a series of burglary convictions. Even more astonishingly, aligning with the FBI's foresight, Spencer initially caught the authorities' attention for arson specifically, for setting fire to his mother's car.
He was presently in a halfway house in Richmond. Well, that That's exciting now.
Spencer resided in a halfway house under probation, situated just a brief distance from where the Richmond murders occurred. House records indicated Spencer had been signed out over the Thanksgiving holiday, spending time with his mother in Arlington the very week Susan Tucker was killed.
The fact that he got out of prison 2 weeks before the first murders down in Richmond, the fact that he was available for every murder, the fact that he came to Arlington when he did for our murder.
The FBI's accuracy also covered another key detail. Spencer lived in the area where the initial assault took place.
And that happened over there. And at the time, Timothy Spencer was living down here over this hill.
Residing in his mother's house just a mile from Carolyn Hamm and Susan Tucker's residences, Timothy Spencer was apprehended by police on January 20th, 1988. Shortly after his arrest, authorities obtained a blood sample, strands of his hair, and seized his clothing for forensic analysis.
The clothing was scraped down for removing any debris, and once that debris was collected, it was taken to a microscope. Several dozen particles of glass were removed from the debris that was removed from his clothing.
The police took special interest in the glass fragments. Following the retrieval of glass particles from Spencer's clothing, the police subjected them to forensic examination to determine if they corresponded to glass found in any of the victims' residences. One method employed is known as glass refraction analysis. By illuminating the particles with light from different points on the spectrum, the glass's traits can be graphed, effectively gauging how the particles bend light.
If you stick the pen into the water, which is more dense than the air, it bends the light. What we're doing with the glass particle basically is measuring how much the light is bent in and we call it refractive index.
They compared the glass fragments discovered on Spencer's clothing with the glass particles retrieved from the shattered window at Susan Tucker's residence.
We were able to say that that glass that was removed from Spencer's clothing either came from that particular pane or that particular source of glass or another source of glass that had the same optical characteristics.
Upon the completion of DNA analysis on the semen stain discovered at the Susan Tucker crime scene, scientists made a chilling discovery.
And I remember pulling out an X-ray film from the developer and holding it up from these two separate cases and being bombarded immediately that the patterns I'm seeing are the same. I'm seeing the same profile on this case from one county versus this case from a second county, which says to me that the same person is involved in both of those incidents. It really gave you chills up and down your spine to see something like that.
Horgus was correct all along. The DNA from the perpetrator involved in the assault and death of Susan Tucker matched the evidence from the Richmond cases.
There were 7 hairs that were consistent with his. There was a glass fragment that was consistent with his. His family couldn't provide him with a complete alibi for the entire weekend.
Lastly, Timothy Spencer's blood DNA was compared to the semen samples collected from the crime victims.
Once we got a sample from Mr. Spencer to test, we generated a profile that was the same as the profile we got from the evidentiary samples. We had a frequency of occurrence of greater than 1 in a million. So that means that only one person in a million in the population would have that particular genetic profile.
And starting with the first result, the blood type, it was a match, it was a match, it was a match, it was a match.
On July 11, 1988, Timothy Spencer faced trial for his life. It was the first time in the U.S. that DNA evidence was used in a serial murder case. The jury deliberated for less than 7 hours before finding Timothy Spencer guilty of assault and capital murder. He was sentenced to death.
Feel some kind of relief, but I'll never have my wife back. No, that's really the bottom line. Is I'll never really feel happy. I can't feel happy about somebody being guilty of raping and murdering my wife. I can't feel happy about that. So whatever anger I feel, I will feel till I die.
Death was pronounced by the attending physician at 11:13 p.m. There were no complications. Mr. Spencer did not make a last statement. Thank you.
Up until his death, I don't think that Timothy Spencer made the connection between semen and blood. I don't think he knew that the same DNA that's in your semen is in your blood.
Without DNA, it would have been impossible to convict Timothy Spencer. If he had committed those murders a year or 2 years earlier, he could not have been convicted. In fact, if this had been 1984 or 1985, we probably would not even have arrested him.
Some people ask the question, will DNA fingerprinting replace detective work? I don't think so. Susan Tucker left Detective Horgus the crime scene, and Timothy Spencer left part of himself at the crime scene. But his name would never have come up if it wasn't for Detective Horgus.